President Trump has never defined the interests at stake for us, but he's also never had any reluctance or any hesitation about supporting whatever the Israelis want to do. It's that simple.
So Marco Rubio was sent to Israel, and one wondered, was he sent there to censure Israel, or was he there to do something different? Well, in this interview, he was specifically asked about America's response to the Qatari attack.
President Trump says he's unhappy with the Israeli surprise strike on Doha. You yourself said that it could derail future negotiations.
It was an Israeli decision, and the consequences are owned by Israel.
So Qatar is convening today this emergency session with its Gulf allies to come up with a response to those strikes.
I don't think it's a mystery that they're not happy about what happened. I think our message is irrespective of that, and that's one thing we need to separate that from the fact that no matter what, we still have Hamas, we still have hostages, and we still have a war.
So the Secretary of State, the chief diplomat for the United States of America, the one who was allegedly involved in running the negotiations we were having with Hamas specifically, says that, oh, well, whatever Israel did, that's their issue here. But as far as Qatar goes, then he says there's still a war going on. Well, yeah, that's why your guy was there, to try to bring it into it with negotiations. And so he totally whitewashes the whole thing. I mean, obviously you can't be surprised by that, but what's your reaction?
Well, first of all, he says Israel owns the consequences. Then he turns around and makes it clear that no, we and Israel both own the consequences, because our position vis-a-vis Israel is unchanged. Just because the Israelis chose to ignore whatever we consider to be international norms or international law, which, let's be frank, have not meant a great deal to the Israelis. And admittedly, we flaunted it whenever we saw fit to do so. That, you know, we're in the same position we were beforehand, and we've said, well, we don't care. You know, it's just irrelevant to us. And I think you're going to hear an awful lot of crying and whining out of the Arab countries, but I don't see a whole heck of a lot of action from them at this point. And action is much more important than words. I would go one step further. I've checked with people I know who are in the defense industries who are involved in Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, and they both said to me categorically, if you know the Qataris had wanted to stop the Israelis, they could have done so. And I said, well, explain that. They said, because we've invested enormous quantities of materiel, radars, missiles, missile launchers, and so forth, lots and lots of training in Qatar. They have probably some of the finest air and missile defenses that exist anywhere in the world. It is simply impossible that Qatar could not have known the Israelis were coming. They would have identified that. And if they had identified it in advance, they would have said, you're violating our airspace. You can't do that. If you continue, we reserve the right to respond. Well, none of that happened. None of it happened, I think, because Qatar was well aware the Israelis were coming. And of course, we were as well. Nothing flies over that region of the world in the Arabian Peninsula, whether it's in the Euphrates River Valley in Iraq or further south over the Persian Gulf. We know exactly what's in the air at any given point in time. So we knew. Qatar knew. So all this whining about what the Israelis have done, I think, is more theater than reality. The truth is, the people that live in the Arabian Peninsula, the majority of these Arab leaders, really don't give a damn what happens to the people in Gaza or in the West Bank. I wish it were different, but that's my conclusion. So as far as Rubio is concerned, Rubio is maintaining the status quo. Fine, that's Israel's decision. It wasn't ours. Wrong. If we had objected to it, we could have stopped it. And we could have put some teeth behind that by saying, if you go ahead and murder these people, we'll stop supporting you in these areas. We didn't do any of that. We're not going to do any of that because, frankly speaking, at this point, Israel owns us. When I say Israel, it's wrong to say the Israeli state. You have this international Jewish capital and banking power and financial power that is inextricably intertwined with the Israeli state. All of that brought together, whether it's in the United States or Great Britain or Israel or anywhere else, constitutes tremendous influence because they are able to literally buy politicians. And they've done it.
And you mentioned, I was just looking here as we're on the air. So this is this afternoon in local time. This is the results of that GCC meeting. Arab Muslim leaders urge review of Israel ties after attack on Hamas leaders in Doha, which is almost exactly what you just said. It's going to be a lot of words and apparently no action. That seems to be the consequence. Just review.
Yeah, I mean, review means, oh, we'll re-examine it. Well, there's nothing to examine. You're on one side or the other. And they've effectively said, we don't care what happens in Gaza or the West Bank. We're just not interested. We want to get on with life. This is more of a, what's the right word, an irritant than anything of strategic importance to us. It's sad, but that seems to be the truth. There's more interest, I think, certainly in Iran and certainly among the Turks and maybe other countries, Algeria. I think the Egyptian population, I think the Arab populations in the peninsula are all enraged, but they don't have any governing power. So they can be enraged, but they're going to change nothing.
And you mentioned specifically the Gaza war. Well, as it turns out, that was one of the other topics of the conversation there with Fox News with Rubio. And they said, speaking of this war, what is the end state here? And what is our definition of winning the war for Israel?
Every single hostage is released, all 48, including those that are deceased. Hamas no longer exists as an armed group that's threatening Israel. If it's not going to end that way, then it's going to have to end through a military operation.
And so he essentially sets up a set of unattainable objectives to have even the possibility of a negotiated settlement, because he said it has to be like the complete eradication of Hamas, which Netanyahu apparently only wants to get via military power. And now then, I think just earliest this morning, the news is that Israel has already started its next invasion into Gaza and a new offensive operation. Because Netanyahu said, Gary, if you can actually put that full screen up there, I wanted to read a part of that because I think it's very telling in terms of the fact that this follows the immediate aftermath of the attack on the negotiators, because it's certainly looking with actions like Israel said, I want to eliminate any possibilities that there is a negotiated settlement. I don't want to take the risk that Hamas might agree to something. And so now then, with that off the table, then we have this operation here, which according to Benjamin Netanyahu, he wants to completely conquer all of Gaza. And I guess I guess we don't have that. Oh, there we go. Thanks. It says Israel launched a long-anticipated ground offensive into Gaza early Tuesday morning. Israel's military status, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu seeks to end the war against Hamas with military force instead of diplomacy. Now, this is, I think this is the Wall Street Journal here. The assault began with a heavy bombardment of the Gaza Strip's most populous areas, where hundreds of thousands of people are believed to still be sheltering following almost 2 years of war that has flattened much of the rest of the enclave. Netanyahu has called the city the last important stronghold of Hamas, but it's not. It's just the next one in line here. And Doug, also, there are, and this almost never makes it into the Western press, literally battalions of bulldozers that are going through and methodically leveling everything that's not already bombed out. This is not a war, in my view, like your view on that. This is more just a methodical destruction of the Gaza Strip's capacity to even sustain life.
Well, I think that's true. I think there are two things right now that should be taken away from Mr. Netanyahu's remarks and the positions that he's articulated in public. Number one, if all of these people that are currently living in Gaza are either dead or gone, they present no threat to Israel. Therefore, we will tolerate no threat to Israel from Gaza. Ergo, you've got to either kill everyone there or drive them out. Frankly, from his vantage point, it doesn't matter which, as long as they're gone. If they're not there and they don't exist anymore, then they're not a threat. And then at the same time, he's looking at his American audience and he is saying, we've learned over many centuries that there is nothing more reliable than a man who can be bought with cold, hard cash. And that's what they've done. If anybody thinks that our Congress is full of hundreds of people who are personally, emotionally, intellectually committed to give their lives on behalf of the state of Israel, they're delusional. That's not the motive. So I think those are the two things that we need to take away from this. Now, the problem, of course, is that even though they may be dead, most of them, or all of them, that doesn't necessarily mean that this will not haunt Israel. This does not necessarily mean that justice at some point in some fashion will not come about. That's the lesson of history. Driving people out is never the end, especially when they're leaving a place where they've lived for thousands of years. Remember, this is something Americans need to understand. There's a big difference between taking groups of illegals who have come into the United States illegally and tried to lose themselves inside the population, rounding them up and saying, thank you very much. You violated the law when you came here and you've got to leave. Therefore, we're transporting you out of the country. That is not the same as what's happening in Gaza or the West Bank. The people living there have been there for at least 1,000 to 2,000 years. They're not newcomers. They're not recent arrivals. If anyone falls into that category, the Israelis are closer to it than they are. But the newcomers have decided that they need to go. And so they're being eliminated. They are being systematically rooted out, killed, or driven out. End of discussion. And we support it.
And you mentioned this a second ago, but we've been talking about the Gaza Strip mostly today, but there's also the West Bank where are alleged around 3 million additional Palestinian people who seem to fall into the same wary eye from Israel, who also wants them out of there too. And now then there's talk about whether there will be an annexation and whether we will support that. So Rubio was also asked that question.
One thing that comes next, at least for the Israelis, sir, is they are talking about their new plans to move ahead with annexation of the West Bank. Is that something the Trump administration is supportive of?
Well, we're not commenting on that now, other than to say that we warned all these European capitals and other countries that if they went ahead with this Palestinian state recognition, which really is symbolic more than anything else, they're responding to their own domestic politics, we warned that there would be a response to that.
You know, there's this feature in media when you're being interviewed or whatever on a television or something where you block and pivot. The interviewer asks you a question, you don't want to answer it, so you block and then you pivot to what you want to talk about already. That is about I almost got the whiplash just watching that one, because she asked about annexation of the West Bank and then he did a 180-degree turn on a totally different subject. And instead of talking about whether the U.S. would authorize something that is absolutely blanket against any kind of international law, the annexation of another of the Palestinian territory, which is also the people have been there for hundreds or thousands of years, he then turns on our allies in Europe and says that how dare you recognize a Palestinian state? There will be consequences. So when Israel attacks Qatar, they're not our ally per se, but we have a military base there, and certainly they were doing what we asked them to do when they went there. No words at all against Israel. That's just their deal. But when our actual allies do something that's in their own domestic interest and recognize a Palestinian state, regardless of whether we think it's a good idea or bad idea, he says that there will be consequences for that. What do you make of that?
I think that he's being partially accurate when he talks about the response, say, in France to what is happening in Gaza, because 1 out of every 5 adults in France is now a Muslim, primarily from North Africa or the Middle East. But when you look at the rest of Europe and the Europeans who are opposed to this, the Europeans are not opposing this on the grounds that they are compelled by the presence of a foreign element in their country that is threatening to them. I don't think so. I think there's a recognition of what is right and what is wrong. But of course, he's not going to say that. We have a population that is showing very little interest. So there is no real pressure on the American government to take a strong position against what the Israelis are doing. On the other hand, we have tremendous influx of hundreds of millions of dollars in cash, billions over time, that are paying for our support for Israel. That's a simple fact. He's not going to say that publicly, but that's true. But Rubio is a very astute politician. He's learned how to avoid these thorny issues as long as possible. But he knows, just as you and I know at this point, that we'll stand by and support the same ruthless war of extermination being waged in Gaza against what remains in the West Bank. It's inevitable. We will. We're not going to change our position at all because there's no incentive for the people on the Hill to give up their luxurious funding.
Well, and speaking of the people on the Hill, there was a meeting last night in Jerusalem where Benjamin Netanyahu spoke before a very friendly audience of Israeli and American people. And according to one report I saw on X this afternoon, I can't validate the number, but allegedly up to 250 members of Congress were in attendance at this meeting. And in the process of this conversation, Netanyahu said a couple of very interesting things I want to talk about. First of all, as it turns out, Israel is under siege.
And we will have to do several things to break loose from this siege that is organized by a few states. One is China, and the other is Qatar. And they are organizing an attack on Israel legitimacy in the social media of the Western world and the United States. We will have to counter it, and we will counter it with our own efforts. I think that's rule number one. The second thing is something that they can do uniquely in Western Europe. Western Europe has large Islamist minorities. They're vocal. Many of them are politically motivated. They align with Hamas. They align with Iran. They pressure the governments of Western Europe, many of whom are kindly disposed to Israel, but they see that they're being overtaken, really, by campaigns of violent protest and constant intimidation. And so they fall into this siege, and we can break this siege.
So as it turns out, the little Israel is the victim in all this. And of course, he's going to characterize everything that's going on in Europe and all this is not a reaction to the grotesque violation of human rights and just the slaughtering and the even the starvation of the population in Palestine, killing women and children with no compunction at all. It can't be that. No, it has to be they are pro-Hamas or pro-Iranian, specifically the two big bugaboos for the United States there that make them eager to support Israel. What do you make of his characterization?
Well, he wants to equate anyone who does not support his liquidation of the Arab population, Palestinian Arab population in Gaza or in the West Bank, with support for Hamas. In other words, if you don't support Israel, then you support terrorism. You support Islamist terrorism. You support Sharia law. I mean, it's all this nonsense. Of course, that's not right. There's a difference between someone who is, a fanatical Islamist who wants to kill Christians and Jews and anyone who's different from them. And these people are overwhelmingly Sunni, and so they hate Shiites as well. We know all about that. There's a difference between that and what you're talking about in the West. I think Hamas is a dangerous organization that the world would be better off without. Am I prepared to support the wholesale liquidation of the population where Hamas was founded in order to achieve that aim? Probably not. Is it worth noting that Hamas is a creature of Israeli foreign policy? In other words, foreign politics towards the Palestinians? Yes, it is. Hamas was funded with Israeli money. It stood up as an alternative to the Palestinian Authority, which in the view at the time of Mr. Netanyahu and others was moving in directions they didn't want to go. In other words, he simplifies it, which is what you do when you're trying to foster support or cultivate hatred. The simpler you make it, the easier it is. He knows that hating in the plural works. In other words, if you can cultivate collective hatred, that's a very powerful weapon. Now, he thinks he's cultivating that against the people of Gaza and, frankly, the Muslim Arabs and others in the region. I think he's wrong. I think he's actually cultivating hatred against Israel and Jews.